Hi, I'm Mitch Allen. I'm the software CTO at Palm, and I'm pleased to have another chance to talk to you about webOS this morning. We gave an overview of webOS back in February when we were working on the O'Reilly book, and that was based loosely on the introduction to the book. And the book's been published. It's been out about a month now, and we thought that it might be interesting to do another webcast this time around the second chapter, another introductory chapter around application basics. So what we're going to do this morning is show you how to get started with webOS development. If you haven't downloaded the SDK or started any development, we'll show you how to do that. And then we'll also show you then we'll also cover building a basic application. So you'll have a chance to see how you would build a basic application. Along the way, that will give you an overview of the tools that you'd use doing webOS development. We'll talk about that, and we'll use many of the tools so you get a flavor for what it's like to build applications on webOS. In addition, we will also focus on a few other topics kind of along the way. These things will come up as we build the application, around the structure of application, how are controllers and assistants, these are terms that are used within webOS, used within your coding, things like scene lifecycle and scene stack. If you have learned some of the basics on webOS, you'll know that scenes are like views in the application, so we'll talk about how those are used, and then how to style your application in a fairly minimum form. We only have about an hour, so there's a lot to cover, and we'll get into it. We'll start where you should, which is on developer.palm.com. I would mention that in addition to these slides, I'm also going to be using a number of applications in this presentation, which you should be able to see in the toolbar here. I'm going to have the terminal application for using a lot of my webOS tools, the emulator, which is a webOS tool that you get with the SDK, the browser briefly, and then TextMate is used when I do my coding. So you'll see me switching back and forth between these applications. I know there could be latency issues with the webcast. I'll try to go slowly when I do that so we don't kind of lose people during these transitions. So we'll start with developer.palm.com. This is Palm's developer site. If you haven't seen this site, you would need to go in and register. You simply have to provide your name and a valid email address, and then an email will be sent to you pretty quickly, usually within minutes, for you to finish the registration process. It's pretty fast to do the registration, and it shouldn't take you more than an hour, and probably a lot less than that. Once you're registered, you can go onto the site, as I am here, and you'll come to kind of the main page on the site. If you haven't been here before, there's introductory material for you to learn something about webOS. There's a place to get started, which we'll explore here in a moment for downloading the SDK, as well as some documentation, both high-level and low-level documentation, and a great resource, which is this forums site. We have tens of thousands of registered webOS developers that come and go on this site, and this is really where they go for questions and to get information to exchange and share things with each other. So whether you're a new developer or an experienced developer, the forum is a great resource for you. But to get started developing, you need the SDK, and you would go to this download SDK area. You can see that it's available on Linux, Mac OS X, or Windows. If you before downloading the SDK, you may need, you actually will need some additional software, this VirtualBox, which is an open source emulator from which the webOS emulator runs on. You need to download that, install that on all three platforms. And then Windows users will need, potentially will need a new version, version 6 of Java or later to run some of the webOS tools. Once you've taken care of the prerequisites, you can download the SDK. You get a package. You should be aware that the package size itself is about 160 megabytes, so you need to keep that you need to consider that when you're doing your downloading. And then once you download it, it's a double-click install, very simple install process on all three platforms, and you're up and running. So it doesn't take too long to go through this process and get get your SDK installed and going. Once you have the SDK installed on Mac and Windows, you'll see that the software, the components have been installed in this location /opt SDK current share. And what you'll see there is some documentation, which is a little bit of extra documentation. Most of the documentation is on the site. You'll see sample code, a copy of the Mojo framework, and we'll be talking a lot about the Mojo framework components. But the Mojo framework is your primary tool set for building your applications, and you have a complete copy of that source code as well as all the visual assets and things that are used within the framework, and that's located in this area. And then you have a set of tools. webOS has some basic tools called command line tools, and they're called command line tools because you use a terminal application like the one I'm going to use in this demonstration this morning to be able to access those tools. There's tools to create a new application and new components within the application, new scenes. You can use these tools to package and install your application on the emulator or on the device, and you can control the launching of applications. There's a number of different kind of launch controls you're given. And there'll be some more command line tools as new versions of the SDK available. In fact, there's a new logging tool that will shortly be available in the SDK that allows you to get dynamic log information while you're doing your debugging. If you are an Eclipse user or a TextMate user today, there's bundles of these command line tools, which means that in both Eclipse and the TextMate, you're able to access these tools through menu options in those tools. In those editors. And Palm is making the command line tools available in a way that allows, we expect there to be other bundles made available for other text editors and IDEs over time. But you can always use these through the command line in a terminal, and potentially over time there'll be more and more opportunities to use them from kind of menu-activated controls, which can be a little bit more convenient. One of the major debugging tools you have is the emulator. We're going to use that a fair amount today, and I'll be demonstrating that shortly. But this is a complete version of webOS that runs on the desktop. When I say complete, but it's complete from a UI standpoint, and includes all the core applications that are shipped with the webOS devices, so you can get a full experience of running webOS on your desktop. It doesn't do all the things that you can do on a hardware device today. It does some of them. You can use a telephony simulator for messaging and telephony type functions for GPS. But some of the things you can't do today are like audio and video playback, some of the communications the services, things like the accelerometer are not yet simulated. But Palm has said that over time, these different kind of hardware capabilities will be added to the emulator, so that as time goes on, you'll be able to do more and more application testing on the emulator. But today, you may need to do some of your application testing on device completely. There's a JavaScript debugger, and there's also, I mentioned there's some logging tools that you have available and other kind of utility tools. So that gives you kind of an overview of what you get with the SDK, and once you have this installed and you get familiar with the tools, you can start developing applications. So let's do that. Let's create our first application. We're going to create a version of the news application, which is used as the sample application in the webOS book. This is a simple news reader. It reads RSS type feeds, news feeds, and displays the stories. What we're going to do today is create the application. We'll build the first scene, the first view of the application, and then we'll add scene transitions. We'll show you how to add other scenes to your application, how to transition between those scenes. We're going to use the same scene for that example, but it's the same kinds of things that you would do when you create new scenes. Before we do that, though, I want to make just a little bit of a recap on webOS for those of you who may be completely new, and this might be your first introduction. You should know from a UI standpoint that applications run in cards on the screen. These are really small web pages. The contents of these cards are like a single web page. They're all written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript like web pages. There's two basic constructs that are important with webOS to start with. One is a scene. The screens, the contents of the cards are called scenes. And then the design of webOS is that you move from scene to scene usually by tapping on something in the scene, takes you to the next scene, or and the tapping might be an entry like one of these chat examples here on the screenshot, or they might be a button like this little attachment icon here, things that take you to another scene. And these scenes get stacked up as you move from scene to scene. You're building a stack of scenes, and then through gestures on webOS, the main gesture is for moving backwards on your scenes is back gesture. You move back up the stack. So we refer to the scenes as stacking up or as scene stack, and you'll hear that term quite often. The other basic construct is a stage, and the cards that I showed you 2 slides ago are a type of stage. It's really, think of a window. A stage is equivalent to a window that you might be more familiar with. So a card is a type of stage. There are others in webOS. On this screenshot, I'm showing some dashboard stages, which are these, like my voicemail alert or my email notification. These are dashboards, and these are actually stages. They're very small, but they're also HTML, CSS, JavaScript documents. And importantly, each stage within webOS is a separate HTML document, so they really are all running sort of independently of each other. The news application itself, we're not going to do all this today, but it might help you to know what the application is designed to look like. A finished application would have a list of news feeds here. You can see some examples here. There's no limit to the number of news feeds. They can be scrolled. News feeds can be added to the bottom. And then above that is a rotating story area. These are the individual stories within the application that rotate every few seconds. So you can see kind of like a ticker tape or a Times Square billboard of the stories kind of rotating through. When you want to look at a news feed, you would tap it, and that would take you to another scene, the story list scene, which would be one feed with a list of stories below it. And again, the stories can be any number of stories. So you scroll to see the stories up and down. When you want to look at an individual story, you would tap that story, then you go to another scene, which is the story view scene, and this shows the story with the title and the contents of the story below it. There's a couple of navigation buttons, which allow you to move backwards and forwards between stories. So if you think of this list of stories as most recent or newest to oldest, then you might tap the newest, and that would show up, and then you could tap repeatedly to get to the next story down the line. So these buttons give you that ability to navigate. You'll also notice that the story view can be accessed by tapping this rotating story, feature story here. So by tapping here, I go to the story view scene. And this shows you that scenes are really independent. There's sometimes multiple ways to get to a scene. Here we get it through the list taps, or we get it this way through the story tap. Today we're going to build this scene. We're not going to look at these other list scenes. We're just going to look at this one story view scene and show you how to build that along with the navigation to move from story to story. So we're going to start by, I'm going to move into my terminal application now, which is here. And this application, from here I'm going to actually build the application. I'm going to use the first of the command line tools. There's a couple things to know about command line tools in general. One is that they always work on a local directory. So you can see just above here I've located into my desktop, a folder on my desktop called Web, which I set up today for this webcast. And so you want to be located in the directory that you're going to work in before you run the tool. I'm going to use the first tool called Palm Generate, and Palm Generate will create a new application or create new scenes with an application. If you just type the tool name, like in this case Palm Generate, and hit return, okay, it's a lot of data. But what I just did was I displayed a kind of a help file for that tool. At the top is a syntax definition for the tool Palm Generate, and it shows you can create a list of options and then give the app directory. There's a list of the options here. I'm sorry for the formatting is a little bit a little bit hard to see, so let me open this up a little bit more. If that's better. So you see the list of options here, and then some explanations of those terms, as well as followed last by some examples using that tool. So you should know that any of the command line tools, you can simply type the tool name, and you'll get this list. So I'm going to create create my application called News. I'm simply typing the name of the application, and that creates that in the directory that I had set up. I'm going to show you this directory. I'm going to launch my TextMate app with the News application now. And so you should see my TextMate window now with a folder list, a directory list on the left. News is the name of the application. It's also the top level folder, and that is followed by the app folder. Within the app folder are two other subfolders, Assistance and Views. Assistance is where your JavaScript code will go. Views is where your HTML code will go. We're going to talk more about these code files when we do the next part of our demonstration, so I'm going to skip over them for now. And let's look at appinfo.json. Appinfo.json is a configuration file used by the framework to handle and manage your application, and it's a pretty important file. It's a JSON formatted file, which, if you're not familiar with JSON, it's a file structure that uses name-value pairs, like you see here. It's a pretty important file structure in webOS. It's not only used for configuration files or application files like this, but it's also used quite a bit in interfaces within webOS itself. If you're not familiar with appinfo.json, then, if you're not familiar with JSON, you might look at www.json.org, which has a lot of information about that format and how it's used. For now, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to customize appinfo.json around my news application. And the first thing I'm going to do is edit this ID property to create a unique ID for my application. It's very important that your app ID be unique across the webOS universe, so that we recommend that you use this reverse DNS notation, so that if there's a domain name that you own or are affiliated with, use that in a kind of reverse format with your application name, and you're pretty likely that that'll be a unique ID. This ID is used in webOS to identify your application, and it's important that it be unique. Next is a version number. You control the version number. The only requirements is that it be 3 fields, like I'm showing here, and that as you release new versions of your application, excuse me again, that it increment, so that each new version of the application is a higher number as you look at this kind of across all 3 fields than the previous number. The vendor name is used in a few places in the UI, so you want to make sure that it reflects your company. Type is actually, there isn't any variations. There isn't any other options other than the web type, so you can just leave that alone. Index.html and icon.png, these domain and the icon properties, these are conventions. You can change the names of these, but you can see they refer to other files within your app folder. By convention, we use these names, but you are free to change them if you want. I'm not going to in this case. But the last change I'm going to make is the title. This title is used at the top of the application window when the application is launched, and it's also used within the launcher, so I want it to be capitalized, so I'm showing it there. Let's look at index.html. That's another kind of important file in a very specific way, and that is it's obviously used quite a bit in web programming and in web content of all types. Within webOS, it's used in a fairly limited way. It's the main entry point for your application. And when you use Palm Generate, you'll get this template, as you can see here. You do need to have the Mojo framework source. You need to have a script tag with the Mojo framework being the target of that script tag, so that it's loaded. If you use Palm Generate, that's done for you automatically, and you shouldn't need to touch that. But one thing that you might need to change at some point is this Mojo version number. This attribute xMojo version is what your application uses to request a specific version of the framework. Today, there is only version 1, so this is pretty easy. But Palm will release new versions of the framework that are not backwards compatible with the old versions, And when they do that, they'll change the version number of the framework 2, 3, and so on. It'll increment. It's important when that happens that you test your app against those new versions of the frameworks. And if it tests, and when you are sure that it's compatible, then you can release your app with a version number that you can increase the version number to the most recent one. When Palm ships these new versions of the framework, it'll also ship old versions of the framework as well. So applications that are using the old version won't break. But it's always a good idea to stay current, and you want to be able to access the new capabilities in the new versions, which you won't be able to do unless you request that new version. So we've gone through sort of just some basic kind of housekeeping here to set up the application now that we've created it. And I'm actually just going to run this application so you can see. I'm going to show you the emulator we'll use to run the application. Let me just resize my terminal so I can bring up the emulator. So now you should see the emulator. Sorry, I have to adjust it just a bit more. You should see the emulator here on the left, and this is a desktop, shows kind of the desktop pattern of the emulator, and this is, from a UI perspective, is a fully functioning version of webOS. Back in the terminal, we're going to create some new, we're going to use some of the additional command line tools. We're going to use a tool called Palm Package, and Palm Package will package your application, and I simply specify the name of my application, and then it packages it. You can see here that the name of the application is sort of split over 2 lines here. It starts with the ID that I assigned my application, com.palmapps.news, uses the version number as part of the string, and that this is an I package, this is a Linux-style application package. And now that I have the I package, now that I have the package, I can install it. So I use yet another tool called Palm Install, and I specify the package name, and then it'll go ahead and install that on the emulator. It gives me a response showing it's done that. Now that I go over the emulator, I'll see that I have my application. You'll see this half moon icon. This is the default icon. I could have created a custom icon for my application. I probably will here in a minute, but you get this by default. And now I can launch the application, and you see that it just has the boilerplate text in it that I had before. And again, this is a fully functioning version of the OS. So you can run any of the core apps, and you'll be able to do a lot of the UI, any of the UI that you're used to, or that you may see on the device with this kind of application. So there's one more tool I want to show you. I launched that application using the emulator, but I also launched the application remotely. So I just typed the Palm launch apps. I used the application ID in this case, and now it launches the application in the emulator. And that's not too interesting because you can do it pretty easily through the emulator, but it's good when you want to customize configuration parameters and do some more advanced controls of the application. You can do it from within Palm launch. Okay, so we've created an application, and we've shown you kind of the basics of that. Let's now start doing something a little more interesting. Let's create a scene within the application. So we're going to create the first scene. I'm going to again use Palm Generate. This time I'm going to specify a new scene on this T-switch, which tells me I want to create a scene. I'm also going to specify the name of my scene. I apologize for this bar. I'm trying to hide this WebEx control so it doesn't obscure the screen. Let me just actually scroll up here a little bit so it stays out of the way. So I'm going to make the name of the application, the name of the scene story view. And again, I'll specify that it's going to go in the news application. So I've done that. Now let me switch back to my code editor, my TextMate, and I'm just going to close these windows. So now when I look in my my code folders, I see the stage. I see a couple of assistants in my assistant folder, and then I see something in my views folder. So let's dive into this a little bit more. So story view is the scene I just created. So I get a scene assistant, which is the storyview-assistant.js. And then I also get a story view folder with a story view HTML template in there. and that's my scene files. I also have the Stage Assistant. This was actually created when I created the application because every application by default has at least a stage. So what are assistants and controllers, and how do they work? Let's explore that in a little bit more detail. So Mojo provides generic controller objects. So these are objects for specific things that Mojo manages. Mojo provides the controllers, and as on the app side, the app provides an assistant to those controllers. And the assistants and the controllers work together to provide all the logic for the scene. The controller is kind of the generic logic that the framework provides for whatever type of controller it is, whether it's a stage controller or a scene controller or others. And then the assistants provide kind of the application-specific logic that works with that. We have assistants as for four major things: an app controller, each stage controller, each scene controller, and even widgets have controllers as well as assistants. We're not going to talk about widgets today. We're really going to just talk about stages and scenes. An application will only have one app controller, and it may or may not have an app assistant. We aren't showing an app assistant for news, but it actually does have an app controller. We're just using whatever the default behavior it is that Mojo provides. But for each stage in the application, there will be a stage controller, and for each scene in the application, there will be a scene controller, so there can be several of those. In news, we're going to have only one stage right now, which is this card stage, so we have one stage controller and a stage assistant, and we are so far created only one scene, so we have one scene controller and one scene assistant. It's very important to know that the assistants themselves do have access to the controller methods, and we're going to show some of those methods here in a moment. So I have a stage assistant, as I mentioned, and a scene assistant. These are both templates right now, as well as a scene template. So let's look at the assistant template. This is what's created by Palm Generate. It looks like a lot of stuff here, and we'll kind of walk through them. But there's a creator function for the scene assistant, and then there is a number of methods. These are the common methods that are used within a scene assistant, and there are different methods because the methods are called by the framework at different times during the scene lifecycle. So before I go further, I want to show you the scene lifecycle and show you why these methods are there and what they're used for. On this slide, on the left, I have a diagram of the different scene methods shown here, starting with the constructor function, which I just briefly showed you in the code, setup, activate, deactivate, and cleanup. These were actually used in the template. And there's a couple others here, which I'll explain in a moment. On the right-hand side, I have the framework's kind of scene lifecycle and what the framework is doing and when it's calling those methods. So when a scene is pushed, when a scene is put onto the screen or when a scene is put onto the screen and into the view, the framework has to go find that scene. Now you notice that we used a naming convention for the scene. Like when we use the name story view for the scene, and it actually shows up in a number of places, right? It shows up as the name of the template. It shows up in the name of the template's folder. It shows up in the name of the assistant and also in the code for the assistant name. And the framework uses the naming convention to find the scene and then call the constructor function for that scene. So this is where you would do, this initialization step is where you would do a couple things more commonly. If there are arguments passed to the scene, and then you would save those arguments at this point and do whatever you needed to do with them. You would have to do other kind of initialization on the scene. Once the initialization is done, the framework actually starts the transition to put that scene onto the screen. And it starts that transition. As part of the starting the transition, it calls the setup method within the assistant. So this is where you would do things like set up your widgets, add event listeners, and do other things that you need to do prior to the scene actually being rendered and put into view. The framework does a number of things to put this scene into view, and then as it's putting the scene into the view, at the very end of that transition, it calls the activate method within the scene assistant. So when activate is called, your scene is in view, and now you're doing things that are based on the fact that the scene is now active and in view of the user. If you have listeners, if you have events that you're only going to listen for when the scene is in view. You would set those up and activate. If you have listeners that you're going to use throughout the scene's life, you would do those in setup. And so these are the kind of decisions that you would make about where to locate certain parts of your code. You see these two other methods in here, ready and ready to activate. These are not very commonly used, but they are available if you want to actually work on elements within your scene between the setup beginning period, the setup period, and the activate period. Once the scene is activated, it's really active now, and the framework is just really waiting for some external event to do something else. And the events that would change the scene lifecycle is either a new scene gets pushed to replace that the old scene that we've just put up on the screen, or that scene, this scene that we just put up on the screen gets popped. And then the transition starts all over again. But this time we're looking at it from the standpoint of the scene that's being removed from the stage, removed from the view. The deactivate method is called. Here you would do some cleanup functions when a scene is leaving the view. And if the scene is being popped, which means it's actually being completely destroyed, then your cleanup method would be called at the very end. One thing to note is you don't usually have too much time for processing in the cleanup method. The framework really constrains how much time you will be alive at that point. So you have to keep your processing at a pretty limit at this stage.